It's Sunday school. Welcome to Sunday school, everyone. And it's a special it's a memorial or a holy day in Jewish religion and culture. Uh, Tisha B'Av. I'm sure I'm saying that incorrectly, but the rabbi told me that was the correct way to pronounce that. Anyway, it deals with the ruin of the temple. Several temples, perhaps. And there's a line in The Rite of Venus that Crowley wrote, one of the seven planetary rites of Eleusis, where there is sort of a poetry battle going on, and each of those rites of Eleusis is represents not only a moment of the exaltation of the planet associated with the planetary sphere, and the rest of the play deals with the fall of that, or the descent of that planetary god to the next lower one on the tree of life. So in a sense, the rite of Venus, which is number 7 on the tree of life and getting pretty low, it deals with a moment or two of the exaltation of Venus and Venus's temple. But the mechanics of it, the dynamics of what's going on, is the descent of consciousness down the tree of life. And so the star of the show, at the climax of the show, is going to be Mercury for Hod, the next lower Sephira. And so there's like a poetry battle going on, and the officer that plays Libra is starting to do poetry suggestive of the mind is superior to the heart kind of thing. And she does a couple of wonderful, beautiful Crowley poems. But finally, Venus gets what's going on. Nobler is the mind than the heart, or nobler is thought than love, kind of thing. And Venus goes, who's just sort of lounging around lugubriously throughout the entire ritual in her beautiful rose-filled temple, is shocked at that and goes, "Oh, oh, it's the ruin of the temple." Well, today's the day that, at least in Jewish culture, they mourn, they lament the ruin of the temple, and it marks it in the calendar. And I spend a great deal of time dealing with the destruction, the ruin of what by tradition has been known as the Temple of Solomon, Second Temple, Third Temple, whatever. And to me, it's sort of an important thing, because Freemasons are obliged to think rationally about these traditional stories, fables, and myths, and things like that, and to put them in proper, wonderful spiritual dimensions, and sort of leading us away from having to depend on the historicity, the objective reality of it all, and focus on the spiritual aspects of it. So In the book, The Key to Solomon's Key, I spend a great deal of time on it. I'm going to share that today in a sort of a twisted, apropos thing. Um, First, we need to try to determine exactly where the Bible narrative actually starts to intersect with the objective, verifiable history. What are the historic roots of Judaism and subsequently Christianity and Islam? Modern researchers have come to some startling answers to these questions. If the Knights Templar had reason to draw the same conclusions, they were indeed custodians of the most dangerous secret in the world. Let's start with the place and time everyone seems to agree upon. There's little debate between secular historians and Bible scholars concerning the existence and vitality of Judaism as practiced in Palestine during the first century BC. Through most of the first century CE or AD, however you want to do it, but BC we could vulgarize as to before the Christian era, and CE or AD is after the Christian era. So that's a 200-year period, and no one disagrees about no credible historian dares presume to deny the existence of King Herod the Great, 73 to 74 BC, or his magnificent temple in Jerusalem, or the priesthood that administered the sacrifices, or the existence and influence of cults and sects such as the Sadducees, Pharisees, and Essenes, all of whom revered a number of scriptural texts that defined their view of Judaism and dictated the exacting detail of divine laws and codes of behavior of this magnificent religion. Foremost among these texts are 5 books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The Pentateuch, 5 books that through their narrative relate the history of the universe, humankind, and the children of Israel. Tradition holds that the Pentateuch was written by Moses himself around 1280 to 1250 BCE. That's tradition holds that. Please make note when I say tradition or Bible scholars, as opposed to, say, historians or secular scholars. Tradition holds that the Pentateuch was written by Moses himself around 1280 to 1250 BC, when many Bible scholars compute the dates for the Exodus from Egypt. And his 5 books were part of the mysterious contents of the powerful and dangerous Ark of the Covenant. Let's look briefly at these 5 books of Moses and try to get a sense of what they are, who wrote them, and where Bible history ends and objective history begins. And this is very Sunday schoolish today. So, children, settle down. Put away your chewing gum and your lollipops and listen to this Bible message. Genesis begins with the creation story of the world and humankind. It plots our family tree and the great events that link God and his people. From Adam and Eve and the fall of man, through Noah and the great flood, through Abraham, who institutes penis mutilation to distinguish his family and people, and his sons Ishmael, father of the Arabs, and Isaac, father of the Jews. through Isaac's twin sons, Esau, who the Bible tells us that God hated before he was born, and Jacob, who the Bible says God loved and later renamed them all by making, and later renamed Israel. So Jacob, God loved, and then he changed his name to Israel. So when they say children of Israel, they weren't pointing to a geographic area. Those are the children of California over. No, they were the children of Israel. They're children of Jacob. I'm sure I don't need to explain that to you. Then comes Joseph, the son of Jacob, Israel, who, after being sold into slavery by his jealous brothers, really showed them all by making it very big in Egypt. Joseph then, in an act of gracious magnanimity, brings Israel, his father, and his entire family, the children of Israel, to the land of the Pharaoh to escape a terrible famine. The book of Exodus continues with the adventures of Israel's family in Egypt. For a while, things are wonderful. Nourished on Egypt's abundance, and the 70-odd children of Israel multiplied exuberantly, and in a few generations became a ponderous population. After a few lean years of famine in the area, they actually became a serious economic burden upon Egypt's dwindling resources. I might add, or perceived as such. In a ruthless pogrom, a new Pharaoh, who never knew Joseph, orders the firstborn Hebrew males to be slain. The mother of baby Moses places him in a basket and sets it afloat on the river Nile, where Pharaoh's daughter is bathing. She finds the baby and raises it as her own. Moses, like Joseph many years earlier, becomes a prince of Egypt. Prince of Egypt. He adds with emphasis. Moses' story is one of high drama and excitement. He discovers his true identity, kills an Egyptian, is banished to the wilderness and has a close encounter with God, and is given magical powers that bring plagues and curses upon Egypt, including the deaths of all Egyptian firstborn males. Joseph is eventually allowed to take the children of Israel out of Egypt. The next three books, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, Moses leads the children of Israel for 40 years of wandering the wilderness and raiding towns and villages. And if you'll look at a map, you'll see the remarkably small area that they wandered around for 40 years. So small, in fact, that if they lined up, the head of the line could snake around and reach the end of the line. They must have gone in circles. But during this time, that was a digression, excuse me. During this time, he receives the 10 Commandments, builds the Ark of the Covenant, and a portable tabernacle to put it in, puts to death a number of wrong-thinking members of the congregation, writes his memoirs, the Pentateuch, codifies laws and ordinances, and institutes the forms and customs of sacrificial worship that must be observed by the people in order to please God. Finally, after a generation of nomadic existence, Moses shows the children of Israel where God wants them to slaughter the natives and settle down, more or less in the area generally known as Palestine. The book of Joshua follows the Pentateuch and continues the adventures of the children of Israel. now identified as a loose confederation of 12 tribes, as they conquer and settle the Promised Land. But it's the 5 books of Moses that first define Jewish identity as a people, a culture, and a religious entity. Other books of the Old Testament, revered by both Christians and Jews, continue the story of life in the Promised Land, how the children of Israel were ruled for a time by a series of judges, and how a great king, Saul, eventually arose from among them to unite them politically. Saul was succeeded by David and then Solomon. Then a string of largely despicable minor kings who would disunite the nation until it fell prey to a series of conquests. The worst of these conquests and dispersals was delivered by Nebuchadnezzar, whose armies destroyed the Temple of Solomon and took the residents of Judah into bondage in Babylon. And that's the first temple destruction that is observed on this day. These books go on to tell us a story familiar to York Rite and Scottish Rite magicians, excuse me. A story that has an uncanny number of parallels to the story of Moses and the Exodus from Egypt. Only in this case, the Exodus was from Babylon. Here we learn that after 70 years of captivity, the children of Israel were allowed to return to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple of their God and dwell once again in their own land. Unfortunately, after only two generations, the residents of Palestine had no idea who these returnees were. They resented them as invaders and foreign occupiers. The prophet Nehemiah and the highly influential scribe Ezra appeared to have been instrumental in arranging the return of the children of Israel to Palestine. They sort of pulled the strings back in Babylon with powers that be to get these hitherto captives that Nebuchadnezzar had captured and sort of put them to work in Babylon. But once Babylon was taken over by Cyrus, they said, that we can't feed all of these workers. Let's try to deport them. Prophet Nehemiah and Ezra insisted that it was vitally important that a temple be rebuilt so as to re-establish their cultural identity in the region. According to both Bible and Masonic traditions, excavators and workmen had to work with a shovel in one hand and a sword in the other to fight off the disgruntled locals, whose neighborly requests at first was to be part of the building project had been rudely rejected by the returnees. No, you can't help us rebuild. No. During the excavation of the ruins of Solomon's temple, this is Masonic tradition, temple workmen discovered in a subterranean vault a scroll containing the 5 books of Moses. something no living person among them had ever seen or read before. This event is the central theme of the Royal Arch degree of the York Rite of Masonry, where a ritual officer portraying the workman is lowered by a rope into a dark chamber, retrieves the scroll, and delivers the exciting news. It sounds pretty cool, though. I also found this scroll, but as I was unable to read its contents, I therefore gave another preconcerted signal and was drawn out of the vault, bearing the scroll with me. When we discovered from the first sentence that it contained the records of the most holy law, which had been promulgated by Moses at the foot of Mount Horeb, the Horeb mountain. Grasping the importance of the discovery, Ezra, remember Ezra was the guy that the part of his job was a scribe, is a bureaucrat that got all of these returnees back out of Babylon and got them a homeland of their own. Grasping the importance of the discovery, Ezra the scribe had a high platform erected from which he could stand and speak to the multitudes. He caused all those who had returned from Babylon to be assembled before him and announced that the lost book of the law had been rediscovered. He then proceeded to read aloud for all to hear the 5 books of Moses. In one of the most dramatic and poignant scenes of the Old Testament, the children of Israel hear for the first time in their lives the actual words of God from God's own book. They hear for the first time who they were and where they came from. They hear why they are God's chosen people. They learn that they are the descendants of Adam and Eve, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Israel. They hear all of that for the first time. They hear for the first time the story of Joseph and their bondage in Egypt, of Moses and their exodus. And that's a story that each of them could kind of recognize in their own life because the same thing happened to them in Babylon. It was kind of a familiar story. And they go, oh, yeah, you mean that happened 1,000,000 years ago too? Oh, gee. Okay. Anyway, I digress. I dramatically digress. A story each and every one of them can identify with because they've just come out of bondage in Babylon. They learn of their wanderings in the wilderness, how Moses gave them God's laws in the forms of sacrificial worship. They hear why God loves them and has given them this land because they are the descendants of Isaac and Jacob, Israel. And they hear why God hates the unhappy local, resentful locals, because they are the descendants of Ishmael and Esau, who is described in the Bible as a gross and hairy man who traded his birthright and any future claim to the land, to Jacob for a bowl of lentil soup. It's right there in the Bible, must be true. After Ezra's reading of the Pentateuch, the people became united in spirit and purpose. A new temple was built. A particular tribe, Levi, was chosen from among them to be the priest class. The laws of Moses were instituted and enforced. Sacrifices, practices, traditions of the old religion were resumed, and the people regained their spiritual identity. Ironically, this most dramatic and poignant biblical scene is rarely the subject of sermons, and never, to my knowledge, the subject of motion pictures. Masonry, on the other hand, makes her members think about it a lot. It's at this point in time, 539 BC. 539 BC. I put some charts up on my Facebook page this morning. It's at this point in time, approximately 539 BC, when historical and critical scholarly evidence confirms that Cyrus the Great of Persia conquered Babylon and began to deport and resettle the descendants of Nebuchadnezzar's foreign captives. It's there, 539 BC, that empirical history starts to hint of the presence of a Jewish people whose center of worship is a temple in Jerusalem. Not that they didn't exist before, okay? It's just not in an organized, unified identity way. I digress. Prior to this, however, there is silence concerning the children of Israel. Our only evidence of Abraham, Isaac, Ishmael, Jacob, Israel, Esau, Joseph, and the Egyptian captivity, Moses and the Exodus and the wanderings, Joshua and the conquest of Palestine, and the kingdoms of Saul, David, and Solomon, only evidence is the Bible. And in this case, the Bible is demonstrably unreliable history. Thomas L. Thompson, professor of Old Testament, University of Copenhagen, writes, in writing about the historical development of Palestine between 1250 and 586 BC, all the traditional answers given for the origins and development of Israel have had to be discarded. The patriarchs of Genesis were not historical. The assertion that Israel was already a people before entering Palestine, whether in these stories or those of Joshua, has no historical foundation. No massive military campaign of invading nomadic Israelites ever conquered Palestine. There never was an ethnically distinct Canaanite population whom the Israelites displaced. There was no period of the judges in history. No empire ever ruled a united monarchy from Jerusalem. No ethnically coherent Israelite nation ever existed at all. In history, neither Jerusalem nor Judah ever shared an identity with Israel before the rule of the Hasmoneans in the Hellenistic period. That's approximately 200 BC. Not 1250 BC. The Hasmoneans, as Lon said, the Hasmoneans Thompson refers to, were the priest family called the Maccabees, who led a successful and historically verifiable rebellion against the Seleucid kings of Syria in the 2nd century BC, and established an autonomous Jewish kingdom that existed until 67 BC, when the area was annexed by the Romans. The next obvious question becomes, who wrote the books of the Bible where these stories originate? And the answer is simple: we don't know. It's clear that multiple scribes and authors were involved. Many traditionalists believe the prophet Jeremiah wrote at least part of these texts, but Jewish tradition, St. Jerome, and many modern Bible scholars think Ezra, the scribe, or the person or persons writing as Ezra, Nehemiah, edited and formatted much of the Pentateuch and several other Old Testament books, including Joshua, Judges, and the books of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. And they did it no earlier than the 6th century BC. Many secular scholars agree generally upon the 6th century date, but also suggest that the same authors actually penned the Pentateuch, and at the very least had a hand at compiling and editing the books of Chronicles, Kings, and several other books of the Old Testament. There are literally hundreds of complex and convoluted theories of exactly who put pen to paper to create the books of the Old Testament. But most seem to dovetail in a greater or lesser degree to the person or persons known in the Bible as Ezra. Furthermore, there's almost universal agreement that the works cannot be traced any further back in time than the 6th century BC. Prior to this, the historical and archaeological fingerprint of a Hebrew people united by a single religion, occupying a nation with its headquarters in Jerusalem, is non-existent. Indeed, according to Norman F. Cantor, Emeritus Professor of History, Sociology, and Comparative Literature, New York University, Rhodes Scholar Porter Ogden, Jacobus Fellow at Princeton University, and Fulbright Professor at Tel Aviv University, quote, he simply states, "The first millennium of Jewish history as presented in the Bible has no empirical foundation whatsoever." That's quite a statement. And I'd venture to say that most men and women of faith around the world would not believe it even if they were presented with uncontroversial proof. It would be a psychological blow of biblical proportions. I couldn't forgive me. To anyone whose religious convictions are based upon the historicity of the Bible. It would be an even bigger blow to the self-image and the geopolitical interests of contending political forces embroiled in today's Middle East conflicts. Combatants who appear to be treating the pages of the Old Testament as if they were land grants whose deeds of ownership were signed by God Himself. Nevertheless, the unthinkable appears to be true. The kingdoms of David and Solomon are fable, not history. The idea of 12 distinct tribes of the children of Israel, with a past reaching back to the 13th century BC, was likely an ingenious concept, fabricated in the 6th century BC or later, to provide a single cultural religious identity to the descendants of a diverse assortment of people with no cultural memory whatsoever. People whose ancestors came from a dozen or more regions conquered by Nebuchadnezzar. People whose real ancestors were thrown together by the fortune of world events and who eventually had to be relocated when Babylon fell to the Persians. And because Palestine was an area undefended by a unified political or military presence, it was the ideal homeland. for such a mass relocation. If considered in this light, both the Bible and Masonic traditions point the rational investigator to at least consider this scenario. And if all this seems like something that could never happen, I need only point to the events of a little over 100 years ago, involving the American prophet Joseph Smith and his successor Brigham Young, and the exodus of the Latter-day Saints to Utah. To quote St. Constance, this shit happens. This revelation is indeed earth-shaking, and not everyone is capable of absorbing such a blow. It would, after all, lead one to speculate upon the unthinkable possibility that a good percentage of wars, the genocides, the hatreds, the feuds that have cursed Western civilization for the last 3,000 years have been and continue to be tragic arguments that began over nothing. It takes the mature pragmatism of a true spiritual grown-up to even speculate on the implications of such matters. However, it needn't spell the end to one's faith in the holiness of Scripture. Yes, it's probably true that Moses didn't write the Pentateuch, David didn't write Psalms, and Solomon didn't write Ecclesiastes or the Song of Solomon, but somebody did. The holiness, the spiritual integrity of these documents is not diminished in any way by their lack of historic reliability. Ask any Kabbalist. Whoever wrote Genesis not only gathered and synthesized the creation myths of a handful of Semitic traditions, he or she did so with the skill of an illuminated mathematician and the insight of a poetic genius. Whoever wrote Psalms, Ecclesiastics, and the Song of Solomon was a passionately devoted saint. These works will forever offer real spiritual treasures to the sincere devotee, but to insist that they are also history is to invite their misuse by social and political entities who are always ready to engender and perpetuate fear and hatred between peoples and cultures for their own interests. And that's where Sunday school preaching will end on this special day. It is indeed the ruin of the temple. What has been called the Second Temple, if you'll look at the charts there below, what has traditionally been called the Second Temple was actually the First Temple. There may have been small tribal leaders who could be blown up into the character of Moses, Solomon, and David. Okay, not that people don't exist and that the myths do come from somewhere, but not like that. Until tomorrow, if any of you are still with me tomorrow, continue to be good to yourself and be good to each other. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Love is the law, love under will.